Welcome to IFES's Dialogues on Democracy. I'm Adam Gallagher, Senior Editor and Writer, and I'm here with Senior Gender Specialist Jessica Huber and Gender Program Officer Tazreen Hussein to discuss IFES's gender equality and women's empowerment work on International Women's Day. Thanks for joining us, Jessica and Tazreen. Can you start by talking about IFES's approach to gender equality and women's empowerment programming?
Sure. Well, IFES works all around the world to bring the electoral process to all people. As part of that approach, very central to the work that we do is focusing on gender equality and women's empowerment activities within the electoral process. We do that in two ways. First, we look at all activities through a gender lens, and we look to integrate or mainstream gender equality activities into all the work that we do. So, for example, if we're doing a civic and voter education drive or campaign in a country, we will also look at ways that we can target women. So advertisements toward women, or showing women and men together participating on a poster. These types of activities are very important to us. The other thing that we do is that we focus on very specifically activities that help to empower women in leadership positions in the political and electoral process, and look at gender equality activities that are specifically focused on engaging the entire community. Taz, maybe you can give us some examples of our work there.
So just to give you an example of this and the impact that we have with our programming, ahead of the historic elections in Myanmar, we worked with a local partner to train over 500 women through our She Leads program. And through this program, our participants went into their communities and worked with their families, worked with their communities to conduct voter awareness and voter education activities. So they worked with their communities to help them understand, when is election day? Where is your polling station? How do you register to vote? How do you correctly mark the ballot? So, these women, they've been able to do this. They've actually been very empowered to do that. And since the elections, they've continued to work on these activities in their communities.
And maybe I could just give another example, Adam, which is we have a great ability here at IFES with our IFES Measure team to do surveys, which are in national settings, questions for communities across the whole country. And one of those surveys that we have is the Status of Women survey. And that helps us get data or evidence, perceptions of people's opinions. We ask women specifically, we seek them out, but we also ask men their opinions about women's empowerment and gender equality. And that's a good way to help us focus our programming on the evidence, on facts and data that we get in particular countries. So, for example, our Nigeria team did a Status of Women survey ahead of the elections, and we discovered that 33% of men believe that women can be president in Nigeria. That's a pretty low percentage. Interestingly, we also, in that same question, learned that 66% of women believe that a woman could be president in Nigeria. Now, that's a lot higher than the men, but it still tells us, what about the other women that are saying we don't believe that a woman can be a leader? So we see in that one question areas of focus that we need to do in order to increase everybody's understanding and support for women in leadership positions.
Great, thanks Jessica and Tazreen. Let's move to talk about some of IFES's newest gender equality tools, specifically Male Allies for Leadership Equality and the Violence Against Women in Elections framework. Can you guys talk about what led to the genesis of these tools and how they were developed, and a little bit about how they've been implemented so far in the field?
Sure. Thank you for asking that, actually. One of our newest tools is the Male Allies for Leadership Equality training. And this came about very interestingly. A lot of people ask us, how did this come about? First of all, we're seeing a broader global call to action for male allies, or those who identify as men, or anyone really that believes in equality, to stand up as allies. The UN has their He for She campaign, and there are a lot of other international actors that have been putting forth some great initiatives to bring forth allies to work towards gender equality. And we saw that a key gap in this was in the political space. And interestingly enough, IFES, through our work over the last 30 years, we've actually been doing this informally. We work with male and female electoral stakeholders, the leaders of which have been predominantly men. But they are also working towards gender equality with the work that they're doing. And so we've kind of taken a lot of our learning, a lot of our experience, and put it into this training module, which focuses on working with male allies both at the institutional level as well as the household level on gender equality, how to recognize it, how to work towards it, and what they can do personally as role models to work towards this goal.
So Tazreen makes a good point. With the Male Allies tool and with the VAWI tool, which I'll talk about in a second, we're addressing something that's been missing. So we're trying to add to the body of work. And we have a women's leadership training program that we've done, as Taz mentioned, in Myanmar and Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, and many places around the world, Cambodia. And we saw that in addition to that, we needed something else. We needed to engage the men that were in these women's lives. And so that's a really important piece to the overall approach of gender equality and women's empowerment work, is how do we amplify the impact? How do we reduce barriers? How do we reduce exclusion? We need to do more and add to. And certainly that's the case with our male program, and also with the Violence Against Women in Elections program. There we're saying, we understand, and IFES has worked on electoral security for years. We understand that violence sometimes does happen in elections as part of a country that's transitioning to democracy, or even in countries that aren't anticipating violence, that it happens and that we need to address it. But what was missing was the gender lens, the understanding of what that violence looks like for women, which in some cases is the same as men. It could be women or men are attending a protest and violence breaks out, and we can see that, and that's visible. But what happens if it happens behind closed spaces? Or what happens if the woman knows the perpetrator and it's a relationship that's existing? Or what happens if a woman says, this thing happened to me and I have no way to report it? So the VAWI framework and the tools that come with it are an attempt to add to our understanding of electoral security and add to it our ability to respond to men and women's needs to address violence in elections. So this point of wanting us to create an enabling environment to do gender equality and women's empowerment work for both men and women, and to want us to make sure that when we're talking about access to the political and electoral processes, we're talking about access from all perspectives, and so that's where these tools came from.
Great. Kind of taking back a step back, since I have you both here and you're two advocates on the forefront for gender equality in the democracy and governance space, can you kind of assess what some of the biggest challenges and opportunities are to furthering women's participation in electoral and political processes, worldwide?
Well, that's a huge question, and certainly something that we're thinking about on a daily basis. I mean, I think let's try to focus more on the opportunities, but just to say, I mean, the challenges are can be enormous in almost any context that we're talking about, whether we're talking about stable democracies or new democracies, whether we're talking about a conflict region or a country that's just come out of conflict. But what's interesting about that is oftentimes it just comes down to the challenge of cultural attitudes. In fact, IFES did a study a number of years ago, I think it was in 2012, and we asked in all regions, what is the biggest barrier for women's political participation? And the answer was cultural attitudes. And of course, we come up with these tools that try to get to some of that. But this is a long-term process. And oftentimes, the work that we're doing is very immediate and responsive. And so having to design those programs in the context of, well, it takes time to change attitudes and behaviors, and that's really what this work is about. And how do we do that in a way? I mean, I don't want to change what I think is right and wrong, and so coming in and asking people to do that in their context is also very difficult. And so that's where we actually try to take cues from local men and women. So, for example, as an American, sometimes it's hard for me to get my head around the idea of a gender quota because we don't think about that in the U.S. context. It's a non-starter, if you will. I once went to do a training, an advocacy training in Cote d'Ivoire a couple of years back. And I said to the women, what do you want to focus on for your advocacy? And they said gender quota. So there was no debate. There was no sort of, what are the pluses and minuses of gender quotas? They said, this is it, this is what we want, and you need to help us make that happen, right? And so I think that was very helpful, and that is in essence the work that we do as international development practitioners, is we take our cues from local populations and then bring the tools that we can to help them get what they want, right? So this was a good example of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, really just to add on to what Jessica said, we're basically in the business of changing hearts and minds, and that takes a lot of time. An interesting example is when we were doing a pilot of our male allies training in Tunisia with Libyan participants. I was speaking to a male participant who was talking about how important it was for him to support his wife, who has just been elected as a local councilor for the first time in Libya. And I asked him, this is a big change for the culture there. What did you do to help support her in this role? And the first thing he told me was, the first thing I had to do was convince her father. And me, with the position that I'm in, talking to him and convincing him of this basically made it happen. And that was just the first step. So we're trying to learn from these experiences through our tools, through our trainings, how to build on this momentum.
Maybe just to end on a positive note, I mean, even though these are our challenges, it seems to us, even in our examples that we give, that we still see the hope and the opportunity. Mm-hmm. With our male allies work, we thought the Libyan men would be, a very difficult audience. This is a very conservative culture, and they actually were so into it. It was really exciting to see, and we did the same thing in Haiti, and we've worked on both our new tools, VAWI and male allies in Haiti, and we see women looking at us and saying thank you for finally validating our concerns about how violent it is in the electoral process in Haiti. And we saw men saying, you're absolutely right, we need to be better for our sisters. And so I think even though this work is hard and challenging, what we're seeing is that people are responding to it.
Thank you for sharing those anecdotes with us, Jessica and Tazreen, and for talking to us about International Women's Day and IFES's work. You can find a lot more information about what we're doing and various publications that we've produced on ifes.org. And thank you for joining Dialogues in Democracy.
Thank you.